Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reacting channel. Today we'll be looking at part 2 of Extra History's Cuban Missile Crisis. This part is eyeball to eyeball. As usual, I will put a link to the original content in the description below. I highly encourage you to head over there and show the Extra History some support if you like what they're doing here. Alright, so let's just get in here and pick up where we left off and see where we're going next.
It's October 22nd, 7 p.m.
Okay.
Camera equipment clutters the Oval Office. 3, 2, 1. The president is live, announcing to 100 million Americans that there are nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Yeah, he's already warned Khrushchev that this is coming. He sends a message to Khrushchev. The Russians were already on to it, however, just by being able to see what the Americans were doing, they could tell that the Americans were worked up about something. They knew that they'd been found out.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
You can tell just by looking at Kennedy that he is exhausted. He's been up a lot preparing for this,
requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The U.S. military goes to DEFCON 3. Missiles and bombers can launch within 15 minutes of a presidential order. The clock ticks another minute toward midnight. This Cold War series is brought to you by Dominations. If you want to get your Khrushchev on, check out the link in the description.
Okay.
Around the world, troops are going on the alert. In Cuba, Castro sounds the mobilization, calling up 300,000 troops to defend the island. He dispatches Che Guevara to prepare for a guerrilla war. His brother Raul surrounds Guantanamo Bay with artillery. 100 miles away in Florida, 120,000 servicemen gather in an invasion force nearly as large as the one deployed on D-Day.
I don't think people understand just how big this was getting. This is one of those events in American history that, yeah, we hear about, but I don't think we quite grasp the scale of the preparations involved, of just how dangerous this is getting and how far people were willing to go to prevent these missiles from being in Cuba on one side and to ensure that they get there and stay there on the other.
600 aircraft clog the runways. Troops sleep in football stadiums. A cargo plane crashes on the tarmac at Guantanamo Bay. Its immolated crewmen are the first deaths in a conflict that could kill millions. In Moscow, the Presidium is buckling down for an all-night meeting. First, Khrushchev issues a statement calling this so-called quarantine an illegal act of piracy. He knows that the term's a rhetorical dodge. Kennedy can't call it a blockade because that would be an act of war. But illegal or not, Khrushchev orders his missile freighters to turn back toward the Soviet Union. He can't risk them being boarded. The other freighters, the ones delivering food and fuel, will continue on. Let Kennedy inspect those. It'll only embarrass him. Their submarine escorts will hold position just outside the quarantine, ready to move in case war breaks out. One freighter, Khrushchev decides, should steam on ahead as planned. Kennedy has delayed the quarantine a day in order to seek international support, and in that time, the freighter full of warheads can still make Cuba. It pulls into a rural port just before dawn. Soviet troops carefully unload its cargo and distribute it to the holding bunkers. Cuba's missiles now have teeth. At 12:05 p.m., 6 U.S. Navy jets take off from Florida, tearing over Cuba at 1,000 feet. They are low-level reconnaissance craft, meant to provide detailed pictures of the missile sites. On the ground below, Cuban anti-aircraft crews are unnerved and itching to strike back. Were those recon aircraft or strike fighters?
Yeah, and this is another problem that's going to be recurring during this very brief period, is nobody's really sure what's going on. Are we dealing with spy planes? Are we dealing with fighters coming in to do the first strike? One wrong move and this can turn into a fairly major war. So there's just no room for error, and it's pure confusion. Just not a good thing.
Were their positions currently being marked for elimination? At 7:06 p.m., Kennedy officially signs the quarantine authorization, but there's a problem.
Of course there is.
XCOM is still debating how the Navy will enforce it. The Navy thinks it's simple. They will challenge every ship to stop for inspection. If the ship doesn't stop, they'll fire star shells. If it still doesn't respond, they'll disable its rudder and board it. If they encounter a submarine, they'll use practice depth charges to force it to surface. Hearing this, Kennedy goes white. Firing on Soviet ships could start a battle. A battle could lead to a war, and a war might mean nuclear annihilation.
And remember, World War II, Kennedy serves shipboard on a PT boat. So he got experience with naval conflicts during war. He's got personal experience on the kind of things that can go wrong, big time.
He dispatches the Secretary of Defense to keep watch over the Navy's war room. There must be no shooting. The Navy was treating this quarantine as if it was their objective to sink ships, but this operation should be meant to communicate with Khrushchev. This isn't whack-a-mole, it's sign language with destroyers.
Yes.
That night, Robert Kennedy sneaks into the side door of the Soviet embassy. It's a back channel that the Kennedys have used before. Robert asks if the Soviet ships will stop when challenged.
I've been to the Russian embassy in D.C. My wife is Russian, and we had to go there for some paperwork and documents at one point. Kind of an intimidating building, but I imagine a lot of the big embassies are. That's just the only one I've ever had experience with. Security everywhere. It was really kind of intimidating.
The ambassador, uninformed about the missiles and with no orders from Moscow, says that they will not. And furthermore, stopping them will be an act of war. On October 24th at 10 a.m., the first suspected weapons freighter is scheduled to hit the quarantine line in minutes. XCOM anxiously waits for news. Then, a message. The Soviet missile freighters have turned back. We're eyeball to eyeball, says the Secretary of State, and I think the other fellow just blinked. Little do they know, there was no showdown. The freighters had turned back 30 hours ago. CIA analysts wanted to be certain before passing on the information, and naval signals traffic is so busy right now, even emergency messages are taking 4 hours to get through. The closest Soviet weapons freighter halted 500 miles away from the interception point, but ships are still coming. In Omaha, Strategic Air Command orders the nuclear force to DEFCON 2. 145
I believe this is the first time we ever hit DEFCON 2.
Missiles stand at the ready. 23 bombers circle outside Soviet airspace, each with enough firepower to level 4 cities. It's 5:15 in the Kremlin. Khrushchev has privately decided that there cannot, under any circumstances, be a war.
And this is a situation where we've got two leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, who are kind of on the same wavelength. No matter what happens, this cannot escalate into war. It just can't. So they're both, but they also can't show weakness. So they're both in very delicate positions. Political pressure is coming in from all sides. You've got your hawks and your doves pushing on all sides. It's just a really horrible situation for both of them. And I think they kind of understand that about each other. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in either one of their shoes during this. But we got to give them both credit. They understood what was at stake here. Some of their advisors clearly did not. And we were so fortunate to have two men in power, both World War II veterans, who understood the dangers in the situation and were determined not to let this escalate into an all-out war.
But buckling to U.S. pressure could destroy him politically.
Exactly.
He needs to walk away from this with a win. He proposes a new strategy: withdraw the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise never to invade Cuba. The Presidium agrees to this. He drafts a letter outlining the deal and dispatches it to the U.S. Embassy. It will take 8 hours to arrive. On October 25th at 5 p.m., the U.S. ambassador to the UN is famously quiet and careful, but Kennedy has made clear what needs to happen. The Soviets are still denying that the missiles exist. He has to go hard and hold their ambassador to account on television. "Do you deny that the USSR has placed missiles in Cuba?" asks the ambassador. "Yes or no?" Don't wait for the translation. Yes or no. "I am not in an American courtroom," argues the Soviet ambassador. The U.S. will have their reply later.
To be fair to the Soviet ambassador, he was not entirely in the loop. As he pointed out several times during this, there's message delay times here, from 4 to 8 hours or more in some cases. The Soviet ambassador's pretty much in the dark about a lot of this. He doesn't know for sure what's going on, so he really can't answer it strictly yes or no without basically not necessarily lying, because that would imply he knew the right answer. He genuinely doesn't know for sure.
"I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over," the ambassador answers. He raises blown-up photographs of the missile sites and lays out his evidence. On October 26th, at 1 a.m. in Minnesota, a sentry guarding a radar station sees the silhouette of a man trying to climb the fence. He fires into the darkness and
not a man.
Raises a sabotage alarm. It's happening. A Soviet commando raid. Pilots across the Midwest scramble into their cockpits. But the alarm is canceled just before the first takeoff. It's a false alarm.
It's
a bear had wandered into the wire.
Yep.
At 7:50 a.m.
Think about that. A bear nearly started global thermonuclear war. That's how tense this situation was.
The U.S. Navy boards the first vessel passing the quarantine line. Now, this is a bit of political theater. Kennedy has purposely chosen a Lebanese freighter with a Greek crew for his first inspection. There is zero chance of it actually carrying nuclear weapons, but it does get the message across. Ships will be stopped. At 12 p.m., the CIA briefs.
Yeah, again, Kennedy and Khrushchev both have to appear strong in this, even though they're both desperately trying to avoid war. So there's a lot of politicking going on here. Conscious efforts to show strength, to project power, but not to cross a line. So this is the Cold War at its height. This is really what the Cold War was all about. It's about posturing, it's about politics, it's about spycraft and backroom negotiations.
XCOM. Low-level reconnaissance has discovered something new. Soviet cruise missiles, probably nuclear. They're positioned near Guantanamo Bay and the coast. Any U.S. invasion will probably be met with a tactical nuclear strike. U.S. generals ask for clearance to use their own tactical nukes. In Cuba, Castro's losing patience. He's annoyed that Khrushchev ordered the freighters to return.
Yeah, and then you have this third player, Castro. He got his own agenda, and he's in a position to make things much worse, or potentially better. And he's kind of a wild card in this.
And furious that the Soviet ambassador is still denying the existence of missiles in Cuba. And most of all, he has had it with the reconnaissance flights. He's held fire so far to preserve diplomatic efforts, but his spies in the U.S. are reporting that an attack may come as soon as tonight. These planes are violating Cuban sovereignty, scouting for an invasion, maybe even preparing for a surprise airstrike. He drafts a letter to the UN threatening defensive fire against any violation of Cuban airspace.
Which actually makes sense. If you put yourself in Castro's position, it makes sense for him to do something like this.
At 6 p.m., Khrushchev's proposed deal finally arrives at the White House. The letter is long and rambling, which is why it took so long to translate, encrypt, and send. It pleads against a war. Kennedy wants to take this deal, but the press, stonewalled by the White House and seizing on statements by a bureaucrat, is reporting that an invasion of Cuba is imminent. If the Soviets believe them, war may break out before he can accept.
Yep, the problem with delayed communications.
On October 27th at 6 a.m., Castro has been at the Soviet embassy all night, trying to draft a statement. He thinks that the U.S. will invade at any moment, and that will inevitably trigger nuclear war. But he keeps vacillating on what he wants Khrushchev to do about it. Finally, the frustrated ambassador asks, "Are you recommending a first strike? Yes or no?" "Yes," he says. In the event of a U.S. invasion, the USSR must launch. Cuba will be martyred, but the global revolution will survive. Meanwhile, in the White House, Kennedy is ordering more recon flights, despite Castro's warning. CIA reports indicate that the missiles are now operational. If one launches, it will hit New York or Washington in 10 minutes. There is zero room for error. One slip might mean the end of humanity. At 11...
You know, like a bear setting off a false alarm. And there's going to be other problems.
16 a.m., Soviet troops pick up a high-altitude plane over Cuba. It's probably a U-2, and it's been photographing their positions in depth for an hour. Their surface-to-air missiles can knock it out, and their general has issued orders to shoot down airspace violators. They call him for confirmation, but he's asleep. So they launch. 72,000 feet above, Major Anderson is listening to his U-2's camera traversing back and forth. Thunk, 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 thunk. Then, a warning siren. An indicator goes red. He tries to evade, the fragile plane creaking as he banks. Then, there's an explosion. Shrapnel rattles through the fuselage. Helmet glass shatters, and then, depressurized silence. Debris falls on the green fields of Cuba. And now, it is a shooting war.
Yep.
This
All right.
episode was brought to you by Dominations. Click the link in the description to play the game for free.
All right, that was a good one. So yeah, Cuban Missile Crisis is honestly one of the most terrifying events in 20th century history. Does not get talked about nearly enough. When I was in high school, we never even mentioned it. I learned about it from my parents who lived through it. It happened about 4 years before I was born. And this is just something I think people need to understand better. This is how close we came to nuclear war. And there were so many opportunities for this to literally turn into a nuclear war. So many times, little things like a bear going up against a fence, or this U-2 pilot getting shot down over Cuba, or there's another incident where a U-2 pilot accidentally ended up over Soviet airspace during this period. There is going to be an incident with a Soviet submarine that I'm hoping they get into that very, very nearly leads to a nuclear strike. This is a masterclass in politics, in diplomacy, and in just the Cold War climate in general. It is all the Cold War condensed down into a single conflict, and just utterly terrifying. Put yourself in the shoes of people living during this period when you don't know what the outcome is going to be. We have the hindsight available. We know it doesn't happen. But if you're living through this, this is horrifying. At any minute, the world could end. It's just a terrifying period to live through. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I've always said it. I tend to ramble. Sometimes I don't know where I'm going. Sometimes I get there even if I don't know where I'm going. Sometimes I just end up in totally weird, random places. But thank you for joining me. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.